been assigned the short story The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K Le Guin in your philosophy class or maybe in your literature class, and you haven't exactly read it. And maybe there's an essay due tonight, but why should you read it? This isn't high school. You should be out living your best life now, not doing stupid homework for losers. Durr. You really should read it. It's well written, it's brief, and it's far more interesting than anything else your professor has assigned this semester. But you don't have time, and that's where Dr. Miller is going to set you up for success. Free of charge, just like and subscribe. Ursula K Le Guin, who passed away in 2018, was an American author who wrote some wildly popular fantasy novels and stories. So if you like hobbits and Games of Thrones and Kidditch, this is probably your jam. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, hereafter Omelas, we're going to call it Omelas. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas was written in 1973. And it was meant to challenge some political and philosophical thinking. Le Guin went to Harvard and Columbia, so she was pretty smart, and her speculative fiction often has a thoughtful philosophical message. Omelas won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story that year. Here's the idea of the story. A parade is taking place in this beautiful utopian city where children play and ride on horses, and there's music, and there's drugs if you want them. Wait, what? Well, the narrator by page 2 is already off on a spiel about what causes happiness, and the point is that it kind of doesn't matter, but everyone in Omelas is their own kind of happy. However, Omelas has a secret, a skeleton in the closet. Well, actually, it's not a secret because they all know it's there, and it's not a skeleton, it's a little child. The child is forced to live in absolute squalor in a broom closet with no human contact. And this, without explanation, fuels the system of Omelas. Here you just kind of have to take for granted that that's how it works. She writes, quote, "They all knew it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it, others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why and some do not. But they all understand that their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of their skies, depend wholly on this child's abominable misery. Some people are upset by this. They wish it were different. But if the child is set free, Omelas would collapse. On top of that, the child, now degraded to a mentally feeble state, could never be restored to health. Occasionally, someone just leaves. They walk away, and hence the title of the story. The story ends with these words. At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not, in fact, go home at all. Sometimes also a man or woman much older falls silent for a day or two, then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down the village streets, between the houses with yellow-lit windows, and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone they go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. Le Guin got the idea for the story from philosopher William James in his essay, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life. There he writes, "If the hypothesis were offered of a world in which certain kinds of utopias should all be outdone and millions kept permanently happy on the one simple condition that a certain lost soul, on the far-off edge of things, should lead a life of lonely torture, what, except a skeptical and independent sort of emotion, can it be, which would make us immediately feel, even though an impulse arose within us to clutch at the happiness so offered. How hideous a thing would be its enjoyment when deliberately accepted as the fruit of such a bargain. So yeah, not really a creative idea on Le Guin's part, more like plagiarism. And the name Omelas she got because she looked in a rearview mirror and saw a sign that said Salem, Oregon, spelled backwards. So yeah, street sign plagiarism is even worse. Better give us back your Hugo Award, you hack. Le Guin is potentially addressing two things in particular. First, it's 1973, a decade after the Civil Rights Act, 6 years after MLK's assassination. America is still rife with racism, prejudice, and the culture of segregation. Perhaps the child represents slaves. Because of slavery, giant populations were allowed to thrive, but only at the cost of horrible degradation of a smaller population of lives. The speculation about the child that, if set free, could not be restored to health would be an accurate representation of the socioeconomic and psychological state of the black community in America in 1973. They did not find immediate equality. The young generation of the 70s were functionally walking away from the America that their parents and grandparents had sustained. Likewise, it could be a statement about the suffering of children and child labor, which was highlighted in the Industrial Revolution with the importation of children into factory jobs, but could just as well apply to child labor around the globe today, human trafficking, etc. Any situation in which a majority population lives a more affluent life because of the suffering into which a minority is forced. Secondly, Le Guin is addressing a philosophical school of thought known as utilitarianism. On utilitarianism, the best thing to do, or the most moral thing to do, is to maximize the overall happiness of everyone. It sounds good until you're the kid in Omelas. Because if maximizing overall good requires a smaller population to suffer, then, on utilitarianism, so be it. Utilitarianism's first thorough articulation came from Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, and his student John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Note, they were writing during the Industrial Revolution, in a time in which the overall happiness of the world was supposedly being delivered by children working in factories and slaves and other such things. Jeremy Bentham was a British lawyer who set out to reform prison systems and failed, but wrote some important works on moral philosophy. He wrote a response against the Declaration of Independence, and particularly took issue with the idea of natural rights, the idea that human beings have been given rights by God to which every individual is entitled. He called this, quote, nonsense on stilts, because it was a moral system that required a God who gave those rights to humanity. And Bentham was an atheist. Bentham began designing a prison for better reform, but no one took it up, and he ended up bitter against the aristocracy and bitter in general. He spent nearly 2 decades of his life on a project that would not come to pass. He was an atheist who lived an angry life. His secretary, James Mill, had a son named John Stuart Mill, who became one of history's great moral philosophers. James Mill set about the project of raising a genius son to carry on utilitarianism. James had been a pastor, but largely lost his faith and was now an agnostic, and brought John Stuart up with no particular religion. At age 20, John Stuart Mill realized that the goal of creating a just society would not make him happy, and he became depressed and suicidal. Later in life, in 1861, he published his famed book, Utilitarianism. He does argue against Bentham that human happiness is more valuable than, for instance, animal happiness, that there's not just a quantity of happiness that needs to be produced, but there has to be a certain quality of happiness. The gist of the philosophy is that overall happiness trumps individual happiness. The problem, of course, is that robs the individual of dignity, which most of us feel is the bedrock of morality. So in the end, we might end up walking away from a utilitarian society in which most people were really happy when we realized what it required. the cost of the dignity of certain individuals. Utilitarianism is the philosophy that says the ends justify the means. As long as the consequences are good, it doesn't matter how we get there. And most people have a moral problem with that. So there's your little summary of the ones who walk away from Omelas. Go live your happy, homework-free lives. The suffering of this one little individual has created greater happiness for all.